Hello everyone! Welcome to my channel Mathematics for Kids. Today we are going to study the relatively prime numbers. Also, we are going to learn how to find greatest common divisors and least common multiples for relatively prime numbers. But before we start, if you like my video, share it with your friends and subscribe to my channel. Let's start together. After learning prime numbers, in this video we'll learn what does relatively prime means. Two or more numbers are relatively prime if they are consecutive or they have no common divisors. Let's take some examples. Let's start by consecutive numbers. 2 and 3 are two consecutive numbers, so they are relatively prime. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 are also consecutive numbers, so they are relatively prime. 99 and 100 are also consecutive numbers. Now let's take some examples about numbers having no common divisors. 5 and 7 are numbers having no common divisors, so they are relatively prime. The prime factorization of 5 is 1 times 5, and the prime factorization of 7 is 1 times 7. So the only common divisor is 1, which is the divisor of the whole numbers. Let's take another example. 16 and 25. The prime factorization of 16 is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And the prime factorization of 25 is 5 times 5. So here, 16 and 25 having no common divisors. So 16 and 25 are relatively prime numbers. Let's take another example. 11 and 18. The prime factorization of 11 is 1 times 11. And the prime factorization of 18 is 3 times 3 times 2. So 11 and 18 having no common divisors. 11 and 18 are relatively prime numbers. Now we learn how to find the greatest common factor and the least common multiple of relatively prime numbers. If two numbers are relatively prime, then their greatest common factor is equal to 1. Let's take some examples. Here we have the greatest common factor of 2 and 3. 2 and 3 are two consecutive numbers, so they are relatively prime. Their greatest common factor is equal to 1. Let's take another example. What's the greatest common factor of 99 and 100? 99 and 100 are two consecutive numbers, so they are relatively prime. Their greatest common factor is equal to 1. What's the greatest common factor of 5 and 7? 5 and 7 having no common divisor, so they are relatively prime. Then their greatest common factor is equal to 1. The greatest common factor of 16 and 25 is also equal to 1 since they have no common divisor, so they are relatively prime. As a result, the greatest common factor of relatively prime numbers is equal to 1. Now, what's the least common multiple of relatively prime numbers? If two or more numbers are relatively prime, then their least common multiple is their multiples. Let's take some examples. What's the least common multiple of 2 and 3? 2 and 3 are consecutive, so they are relatively prime. And their least common multiple is their multiples. 2 times 3, which is equal to 6. Another example. What's the least common multiple of 99 and 100? 99 and 100 are consecutive numbers, so they are relatively prime. And their least common multiple is their multiplication, 99 times 100, which is equal to 9,900. Another example. What's the least common multiple of 5 and 7? 5 and 7 having no common divisor, so they are relatively prime. And their least common multiple is their product, 5 times 7. 5 times 7 is equal to 35. The last example. What's the least common multiple of 16 and 25? 16 and 25 having no common divisor, so they are relatively prime. And their least common multiple is their product, 16 times 25. In this part, we'll talk about factors. We already learned what does factoring mean. But now, if we have two numbers and we need to check which one is the factor of the other. Here's an example, 2 and 6. Which one is the factor, 2 or 6? For sure, 2 is a factor of 6, since 2 times 3 is equal to 6. Let's take another example, 8 and 24. Which one is the factor of the other, 8 or 24? 8 is a factor of 24, since 8 times 3 is equal to 24. Another example, 9 and 72. Which one is the factor of the other, 9 or 72? For sure 9. 9 is a factor of 72, since 9 times 8 is equal to 72. And we use the factors of numbers to find the greatest common factor and the least common multiple of these numbers. Let's start by finding the least common multiple of the numbers. If we have two numbers a and b where a is a factor of b, then the least common multiple of a and b is equal to b, the multiple of a. So if we have two numbers a and b where a is a divisor of b, the least common multiple is the multiple, is not the divisor, which is b. Let's take an example. Here we have to find the least common multiple of 3 and 9. Since 3 is a factor of 9, because 3 times 3 is equal to 9, so the least common multiple of 3 and 9 is equal to 9, since 9 is a multiple of 3. Let's take another example. What's the least common multiple of 6 and 54? Since 6 is a factor of 54, because 6 times 9 is equal to 54, so the least common multiple of 6 and 54 is 54, because 54 is multiple of 6. Now, how to use factors to find the greatest common factor? If we have two numbers a and b where a is a factor of b, then the greatest common factor is a. So we choose here the divisor. Let's take an example. What's the greatest common factor of 3 and 9? Since 3 is a factor of 9, because 3 times 3 is equal to 9, so the greatest common factor here is the factor 3. Let's take another example. What's the greatest common factor of 6 and 54? Since 6 is a factor of 54, 6 times 9 is equal to 54, then the greatest common factor is 6. So here in the greatest common factor we choose the factor, and in the least common multiple we choose the multiple. If a is a factor of b. In this video we learned what does relatively prime mean, and how can we use relatively prime numbers and factors to find the greatest common factor and the least common multiple of two numbers a and b. We also use the symbols equal, times, LCM for the least common multiples of a and b, and GCF for the greatest common factor of a and b. We'll meet in the next video. Bye bye.